The first gunshot was an insult to the morning's peace. The second was a declaration of war. Dust and splintered wood erupted from the frame of the Redemption Creek bank as a volley of rifle fire shattered the quiet. Inside, the world had compressed into a chaotic storm of gunpowder shouting and the high, thin scream of the elderly bank teller, Mr. Abernathy. Jack Calder, once a U.S. Marshal, and now little more than a ghost haunting his own ranch, found himself caught in the maelstrom. He had come to town for salt and coffee, not for a reunion with the violence he had sworn to leave behind. He lay flat on the floorboards, the familiar acrid smell of burnt powder filling his nostrils, dragging him back to memories he fought daily to suppress. 3 men, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, moved with brutal efficiency. 2 kept their rifles trained on the half-dozen terrified townsfolk, while the third, their leader, vaulted over the teller's cage. This man was different. He moved not with the frantic energy of a common thief, but with a chilling theatrical grace. He was tall and lean, his duster immaculate, despite the chaos. When he ripped the bandana from his face, he revealed a smile that was both charismatic and cruel. His eyes, the color of a washed-out winter sky, swept the room with an unnerving calm. Now, he said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the ringing in Jack's ears. No need for hysterics. This is a simple transaction. He turned to Mr. Abernathy, who was trembling so violently the keys in his hand sounded like a rattlesnake's warning. The vault, old man, if you please. Abernathy fumbled his fingers, refusing to obey. The leader's smile tightened. With a sigh of theatrical impatience, he brought the butt of his pistol down in a vicious arc, striking the old man across the temple. Abernathy collapsed with a soft, wet sound, a crumpled sack of tweed in fear. A woman gasped, stifling a sob. The leader, Silas Kane, paid her no mind. His gaze continued its slow, deliberate sweep of the room, and then it stopped. It locked onto a young woman cowering near the wall, Mary, the schoolteacher's daughter. She was clutching a small purse to her chest, her knuckles white. Silas's smile widened. He walked toward her, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "What have we here?" He murmured, his voice laced with a predatory charm. He reached out and, with a surgeon's precision, plucked a thin, silver chain from around her neck. Dangling from it was a small, heart-shaped locket. Mary whimpered, "Please, it was my mother's." Silas held the locket up to the light, filtering through the dust-choked air. "Beautiful," he mused, his thumb tracing its etched surface. He clicked it open. Inside, on one side, was a faded tintype of a woman, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On the other, a newer, sharper portrait of Jack's wife, Sarah. Jack's blood went cold. He had given that locket to Mary's mother years ago, after Sarah's passing, a small token for a friend who had shown him kindness in his darkest hour. It was one of the last 2 portraits of Sarah he had. The other was in his worn leather wallet, a constant, painful reminder of the life he had lost. This was no random theft. Silas Kane hadn't just stumbled upon it. He had looked for it. As Silas's eyes met Jack's across the room, a flicker of triumphant recognition passed between them. It was a look that said, "I know who you are, and this is just the beginning." Silas snapped the locket shut, the click as loud as a hammerfall in the tense silence. He slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. "A keepsake," he said, his voice a mocking purr. He turned back to his men. "We have what we came for." They backed out of the bank with their rifles still trained on the frozen figures inside. The last thing Jack saw before they disappeared into the blinding sunlight was Silas Kane's chilling smile. It was the smile of a man who wasn't just stealing money. He was collecting a debt, and the currency was pain. The silence that descended in their wake was heavier and more terrifying than the noise had been. For the first time in 6 years, the ghost in Jack Calder had a reason to hunt again. The sun that beat down on Jack's ranch was a merciless tyrant, scorching the soul from the cracked, thirsty earth. It bleached the timber of his cabin to the color of bone and baked the silence into the very air he breathed. This was his sanctuary, the place he had retreated to when the world of men became too loud, too stained with blood and compromise. Now, in the days following the robbery, that silence felt different. It was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. He worked with a meticulous, lonely precision that had become his ritual of forgetting. He mended a stretch of fence along the north pasture, his hands moving with the practiced ease of a man who preferred the company of wood and wire to that of his own thoughts. He'd wrap the wire, pull it taut with the pliers, and hammer the staple home a 3-beat rhythm against the vast, empty symphony of the plains. But with every fall of the hammer, he saw the silver glint of the locket. With every creak of strained wire, he heard Mary's whimper. His cabin was a monument to a life suspended in time. Sarah's rocking chair still sat by the hearth, its wood worn smooth in the places her hands used to rest. A stack of her favorite books sat on the mantelpiece, gathering a fine layer of dust he could never bring himself to wipe away. The silence within those 4 walls was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the soft groan of aging timber. He often found himself speaking to his horse, a stoic buckskin named Ghost, more than he had spoken to any human in the past year. He knew Ghost, Jack murmured one evening, brushing the horse's coarse mane. He looked right at me. It wasn't about the money. Ghost flicked an ear, his large dark eye reflecting the fiery hues of the sunset. He offered no judgment, only a patient grounding presence. That was more than most men could offer. Jack had buried his marshal's star along with his wife. He had buried the man who believed justice could be found at the end of a rope or the barrel of a gun. That man was zealous, arrogant, and certain of his own righteousness. That man had made mistakes that had cost other men their lives. Jack Calder, the rancher, was his penance. A quiet life of solitude and hard labor to atone for the sins of a past he couldn't outrun. But Silas Kane had reached into that past and ripped out its most sacred relic. The locket wasn't just a picture of Sarah. It was the memory of her laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, the promise of a future that had been stolen from them by a fever that swept through the valley like a phantom thief. To pursue Silas wasn't just about justice for Redemption Creek. It was about reclaiming the last untainted piece of his heart. It was a quest to silence the ghost of Sarah, who whispered his name on the wind that swept through the canyons, a wind that always sounded like it was speaking of forgotten sorrows. A week after the robbery, the clop of approaching hooves broke the stillness of the afternoon. Jack was on his porch cleaning his rifle, a habit he'd picked back up without conscious thought. He watched as a lone rider approached, slumped in the saddle with the weariness of a man carrying the weight of a whole town on his shoulders. It was Sheriff Miller. The sheriff was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape as the canyons that surrounded them. His face was a road map of worry lines, his hands gnarled from years of holding onto both reins and the fragile rule of law. He dismounted with a groan, his movement stiff and slow. "Jack," he said, his voice gravelly from trail dust and fatigue. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Sheriff Jack acknowledged not bothering to stand. Miller leaned against a porch post, catching his breath. "The trail's gone cold. Kane and his men, they vanished north of the Cimarron. It's like they were swallowed by the rocks." He sighed, the sound heavy with defeat. "Jack, I'm too old to chase ghosts. The council wants me to call in the marshals from Laramie, but that'll take weeks. By then, Kane will be in Mexico. But you were born for it." Jack's hands stilled on the rifle, I'm not that man anymore, Abe. The hell you're not. Miller retorted, his weariness replaced by a spark of frustration. I saw your face in that bank. This isn't about the town's money, and we both know it. It's about the locket. It's about Sarah. Jack's jaw tightened. He said nothing, continuing to wipe down the rifle's barrel with a slow, deliberate motion. Miller pressed on, his voice softening. Doc Evans is tending to Abernathy. He'll live, thank God. But he's scared, Jack. Everyone is. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a performance. Kane wanted to send a message. The mention of Doc Evans, a man whose educated, observant nature Jack respected, gave him pause. The doctor missed nothing. That evening, Jack rode into the hushed town of Redemption Creek. The usual evening bustle was gone, replaced by an anxious quiet. He found Sheriff Miller and Doc Evans in the saloon, the only place that still showed signs of life. Doc Evans, a man of science in a world of superstition, sat with a glass of whiskey, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Jack," he said with a nod, "I was wondering when you'd ride in." "Tell me about the teller," Jack said, getting straight to the point. "Abernathy is shaken, but his memory is clear," the doctor replied, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "He told me something interesting. He said the leader, this Silas Kane, had a strange, deliberate calm. He wasn't rushed. He didn't seem interested in the cash in the drawer, only the vault. And when Abernathy went down, Kane didn't even glance at him. He walked straight to Mary." Jack's focus sharpened. He knew what he was looking for. "Precisely," Evans confirmed. "It was as if he had a list. Abernathy said Kane even made a comment as he took the locket, something about reclaiming what was owed." Miller looked at Jack, his expression grim. "This is personal, son. He came here for you." Jack stood, his decision made. The reluctance in his heart was being burned away by a cold, rising anger. This wasn't about the law anymore. This was a reckoning. "I'll need supplies," he said, his voice flat and hard. 3 days' worth. And tell me which way north of the Cimarron they were headed." Sheriff Miller's shoulders sagged with relief. "They cut through Devil's Jaw Pass. It's rough country. Only a madman or a man who knows it well would go that way." As Jack left the saloon, the doctor's voice stopped him. Jack Evans called out, "Be careful. A man seeking revenge should dig 2 graves." Jack didn't look back. "I'm not seeking revenge," he said to the swinging saloon doors. "I'm collecting a debt." He was lying, and he knew it. He was once again the man he had tried to bury, and he was riding out to dig a grave. He just wasn't sure whose it would be. The trail through Devil's Jaw Pass was a scar carved into the face of the earth, a treacherous path of jagged rock and shifting scree. The wind howled through the narrow canyon, a mournful dirge for all the men who had lost their way in its unforgiving embrace. For 2 days Jack rode hard, pushing Ghost to the limits of endurance. He was a hunter again, the instincts of his former life reawakening with a sharp and painful clarity. He found their trail where Miller had said it would be 3 horses shod with a distinctive V-notch on the left forefoot, a farrier's mark from the South Territories. They weren't trying too hard to hide. They were arrogant. On the 3rd morning, a thin plume of smoke rising from a box canyon gave them away. Jack dismounted, tethering Ghost in a thicket of junipers. He moved the rest of the way on foot, silent, as a predator, his rifle held low and ready. The canyon walls muffled the sounds from the camp below, but as he crawled to the edge of the rim rock and peered down, the scene unfolded. 3 men were gathered around a low fire. 2 of them fit the description of Silas's thugs. One a jumpy youngster who couldn't sit still, and the other a brutish heavy with a dull, vacant expression. Silas was nowhere to be seen. But they were not alone. Tied to a scrub cedar was a woman. Her wrists were bound, her clothes torn, but her posture was one of defiant fury. She was Native American, her features sharp and proud, her long black hair matted with dust. She met the brutish outlaw's leering gaze, not with fear, but with a cold, simmering hatred. This was not a passive victim awaiting rescue. This was a survivor, biding her time. Jack formulated a plan. A direct assault was suicide. He needed a diversion. His eyes scanned the canyon rim above the camp and found what he was looking for, a precariously balanced slab of rock, held in place by little more than loose shale and wishful thinking. He worked his way around the ridge, moving with the patience of a spider. He found a sturdy dead branch and, using it as a lever, began to work it under the rock. With a final grunting heave, the slab gave way. It tumbled down the canyon wall, dislodging a cascade of smaller rocks and dirt. The rock slide thundered into the canyon, not directly on the camp, but close enough to send the outlaws scrambling for cover in a cloud of dust and panic. In that moment of chaos, the woman acted. With a strength born of desperation, she surged against her bonds. The rope frayed from her earlier struggles snapped. She was free. She didn't hesitate, didn't look back, but sprinted for the far end of the canyon. The jumpy youngster recovered first, raising his rifle and firing a wild shot that kicked up dust near her feet. Jack had his target. He sighted down the barrel of his own rifle, squeezed the trigger, and the kid crumpled to the ground. The brutish heavy roared in anger, turning and firing blindly toward the rim rock. Bullets whined past Jack's head, chipping stone from his cover. Jack fired again, his shot hitting the heavy in the shoulder, spinning him around. It was then that he felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his side. A third man, one he hadn't seen, had been posted as a sentry on the opposite ridge. Jack had been so focused on the camp that he'd missed him. He staggered back, clutching his side at the world tilting crazily. Through a haze of pain, he saw the woman Ilara double back. She grabbed the fallen youngster's pistol and, with a steady hand, fired up at the hidden sentry. The man cried out and tumbled from his perch. The heavy clutching his wounded shoulder was trying to reload. Jack, fighting through the pain, took aim one last time and fired. The big man fell and didn't move again. Silence descended upon the canyon, broken only by the whisper of the wind and Jack's own ragged breathing. Ilara ran to him, her face a mask of wary assessment. She looked at the wound in his side, then back at his face. Her eyes were dark and intelligent, holding no gratitude, only a survivor's pragmatism. "You're hit bad," she stated, her voice quiet but strong. "I'll live," Jack gritted out, pressing his hand against the bleeding wound. "The one who led these men, Silas Kane, where did he go?" She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "He rode west an hour ago, alone." She paused. "He took my horse." "He has something of mine," Jack said. "I need to know where he's headed." Her gaze was cold and unflinching. "Information is not free. You saved my life, but you brought this fight to me. Now you are wounded and a liability." Her tone was not cruel, just brutally honest. It was the transactional language of survival, a language Jack understood all too well. "Help me, and I'll get your horse back." He offered, the words strained. "And when I find Kane, you'll be far away from here." She considered this, her eyes scanning the desolate landscape, as if weighing her chances alone against her chances with a wounded man. Finally, she gave a curt nod. "First, we stop the bleeding. Then we talk." She tore a strip of cloth from her own torn dress and began to fashion a crude but effective pressure bandage for his wound. As her fingers worked deft and sure, Jack realized he had not rescued a victim. He had stumbled upon an ally, one every bit as determined and dangerous as the man they both now had reason to pursue. His quest for the locket had just become far more complicated. The desert stretched before them, a vast, indifferent canvas of ochre and rust. Every step was an agony for Jack. The bullet had gone clean through, but the wound was a fiery torment in his side, and with each jolt of the horse, a fresh wave of nausea washed over him. They rode one of the outlaws' horses, a rangy sorrel with Alara in the saddle, and Jack slumped behind her, his arms loosely around her waist for balance. It was a humiliating and necessary arrangement. For the first day, they traveled in a tense, watchful silence. Alara proved to be a skilled tracker, her eyes reading the subtle signs in the landscape that Jack in his pained state would have missed: a freshly broken branch, a scuffed rock, the faint impression of a horseshoe in a patch of hardpan clay. She was his eyes, and he, with his knowledge of the territory, was her map. It was a partnership born of pure necessity. That night, they made a cold camp in a shallow arroyo, the sliver of a moon offering little light and no warmth. Alara built a smokeless fire, a small pit of embers that glowed like a dragon's eye in the darkness. She cleaned and redressed his wound with an efficiency that suggested it was not the first time she had tended to such an injury. "He isn't just a thief," she said finally, her voice low as she worked. Her words were not an invitation to conversation, but a statement of fact. "What do you mean?" Jack asked, his voice rough. "He is methodical. He talks to himself, or to someone who isn't there." She paused, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "He speaks of the past, of a debt that must be paid in blood. He is a man haunted by ghosts." Jack thought of the locket, of the look in Silas's eyes. He knew she was right. "He carries a piece of silver," Alara continued, her voice barely a whisper. "A tarnished dollar coin. He flips it when he thinks no one is watching. I saw the date on it once when the sun caught it just right. 1873. The year hit Jack like a physical blow. 1873. The year of the Black Creek Station train derailment. A botched robbery, a dozen dead, and a bloody manhunt that had ended in a hail of bullets. Jack had been there. A young cocky U.S. Marshal, barely a year in the service, eager to make a name for himself. The memory was a dark stain on his soul, one he had tried to wash away with years of solitude. Over the next few days, as they tracked Silas westward, their cautious alliance began to solidify. They fell into a rhythm. She would hunt for small game, he would navigate by the stars. They spoke little, but a silent understanding grew between them. They were two solitary people, both scarred by the world, finding a strange comfort in their shared purpose. Their journey was punctuated by the discovery of Silas's abandoned campsites. But these were not the hasty camps of a man on the run. They were deliberate, almost ritualistic. At the first sight, they found a child's worn-out doll, its button eyes staring blankly at the sky, placed carefully on a flat rock. The sight sent a cold shiver down Jack's spine, stirring a vague, unsettling memory he couldn't quite grasp. At the next camp, nestled in the shadow of a towering butte, a single black feather was stabbed into the dirt in the center of the dead campfire. To Alara, it was meaningless. To Jack, it was another ghost from the past. The posse he'd led in '73 had a Cheyenne scout who used a black feather as his sign. The scout had been the first to die in the final confrontation. "These are messages," Jack said, his voice grim as he stared at the feather. "For whom?" Alara asked. "For me," Jack admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Alara's gaze was sharp and perceptive. "This man Kane, you have a history with him." Jack finally broke his long-held silence. He told her about the train derailment, about the posse, about the man they had been hunting, the supposed leader of the gang, a homesteader named Daniel Kane. He spoke of the final shootout at an isolated cabin of the fierce resistance, and of the moment he, Jack Calder, had fired the fatal shot. "We were told he was a hardened killer," Jack said, his voice hollow. "The railroad company had a warrant out. They said he and his gang were responsible for a string of robberies." As they rode on, the strange totems Silas left behind became more personal, more pointed. A rusted railroad spike, a page torn from a Bible with the verse from Numbers, "Be sure your sin will find you out," circled in charcoal. Each clue was a key, unlocking a chamber of Jack's memory he had sealed shut long ago. He was not just tracking a man. He was being led on a pilgrimage through his own past, forced to confront the sins he thought he had buried. The locket was no longer just a piece of his heart. It was bait in a trap that had been set for him years ago. And with every mile they traveled, he could feel its jaws slowly closing around him. The trail led them to the ruins of the Mission San Esteban, a crumbling adobe skeleton, bleaching under the relentless sun. Its bell tower stood like a lonely sentinel against the horizon, a monument to a faith that had long since abandoned this forsaken land. A single horse, Ilara's powerful gray, was tethered near the arched entrance. Silas Kane was here. He was waiting. "This is where it ends," Ilara said, her voice a low murmur. "Be careful, Jack. A cornered snake is at its most dangerous." "He's not cornered," Jack replied grimly. "He's planned this. This is his stage." He left Ilara with the rifle concealed behind a cluster of rocks, with a clear line of sight to the mission entrance. "If he makes a move, don't hesitate," he told her. Her nod was all the confirmation he needed. Jack walked into the mission's courtyard alone, his hand hovering over the butt of his revolver. The air was still and heavy. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the collapsed roof. Silas Kane stood in the center of the ruins by the remains of an old stone altar. He was cleaning his fingernails with a Bowie knife, the picture of nonchalant menace. The silver locket lay on the altar beside him, gleaming in the sunlight. "Calder," Silas said, without looking up, his voice echoing in the hallowed silence. "I was beginning to think you'd lost my trail. Punctuality is a virtue you know. Something your generation seems to have forgotten." "Give me the locket," Kane, Jack said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He finally looked up, his pale eyes boring into Jack. "Oh, this." He picked up the locket, letting it swing from its chain. "This is just a symbol, a token. But you came all this way for it, didn't you? Just as I knew you would. You see, I know you, Jack. I know what you value. You don't know anything about me." "I know everything," Silas hissed, his manufactured calm cracking to reveal the raw fury beneath. He tossed the tarnished silver dollar he carried into the air, caught it, and held it out on his palm. The date was clearly visible, 1873. "Do you remember this year, Marshal? Do you remember Black Creek Station?" Jack's blood ran cold. "I remember a gang of thieves who got what they deserved." "Thieves?" Silas's voice rose to a roar. "My brother Daniel Kane was a homesteader. The railroad barons wanted his land for a new spur line. When he refused to sell, they framed him. They manufactured evidence, paid off witnesses, and sent their pet lawman, a young ambitious marshal named Jack Calder, to dispense their brand of justice." The pieces clicked into place in Jack's mind, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. The doll, the feather, the railroad spike, it was all a reconstruction of the past. "Daniel wasn't a criminal," Silas continued, his voice trembling with a grief that had festered into hatred over a decade. "He was a desperate man trying to protect his family. When your posse surrounded his cabin, his wife and 6-year-old son were inside. He wasn't firing at you to protect stolen loot. He was firing to protect them. Jack's certainty, the bedrock of his entire identity as a lawman, crumbled into dust. He remembered the ferocity of the fight and the refusal to surrender. He had seen it as proof of guilt. Now he saw it as the last stand of a desperate father. After you put a bullet in his heart, Silas spat, his face contorted with pain. The railroad took the land. His wife. She had nowhere to go. She and my nephew starved to death that winter. I found their bones the following spring. He stepped closer, his eyes burning with an incandescent rage. So I made a promise on their graves. I would not simply kill you, Calder. That would be a mercy you don't deserve. I would strip you of everything you hold dear, just as you stripped me of my family. I would make you feel the hollowness I have felt every day for 10 years. He held up the locket. This isn't a trophy. It is a symbol of the wife you got to have, the life you got to live, while Daniel's wife wasted away in a shack. Her cries for help unheard. The robbery, the clues. It was all to lead you here, to this altar, to your confession. The world tilted under Jack's feet. He was not the hero of this story. He was the villain. The righteous marshal was a pawn, an executioner in a land dispute. His entire past was a lie, and the justice he had prided himself on was nothing but a bloody sham. Silas Kane wasn't a madman. He was a man with a grievance more righteous and terrible than Jack could have ever imagined. The quest for the locket was over. The quest for atonement had just begun. The revelation shattered Jack's world. The man he had been, the confident, righteous U.S. Marshal, was a fiction, a construct, built on a foundation of lies, fed to him by powerful men. The guilt that had haunted the edges of his solitude for years now flooded in a black tide that threatened to drown him. He saw it all with sickening clarity. Daniel Kane's face not as a defiant outlaw, but as a terrified father. The smoke from the cabin not as the end of a manhunt, but as the funeral pyre of an innocent family. Silas, seeing the devastation on Jack's face, let out a long, shuddering breath at the tension of a decade-long vendetta finally released. He pocketed the locket. "This is not over, Calder," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "This is merely the intermission." With that, he backed away into the shadows of the ruined mission, and before Jack could react, a whistle echoed through the courtyard. A second horse hidden in the ruins emerged with one of Silas's men. Silas mounted, and without a backward glance, spurred the horse and galloped away into the desert, leaving Jack alone with the ghosts he had created. Elara emerged from her hiding place, rifle in hand, her expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "What happened? Why did you let him go?" Jack couldn't answer. He sank to his knees before the stone altar, the strength gone from his limbs. His hands shook, the same hands that had held a gun with unwavering certainty. He looked at them now and saw only the blood of an innocent man. He saw Daniel's face in the shifting shadows, heard his wife's cries on the wind. For 2 days, they rode in near total silence. Jack was a hollow shell, his moral compass shattered. He barely ate, his sleep plagued by nightmares. Elara watched him, her quiet patience a lifeline in his sea of despair. She did not pry or offer empty platitudes. She simply was there, a steady presence against his turmoil. On the second night, as they sat by the fire, Jack finally spoke, his voice raspy. "Everything I thought I stood for, it was a lie." Elara looked at him, her gaze deep and knowing. She had seen this kind of brokenness before. "Vengeance is a fire that burns the hand that holds it," she said softly, her words drawn from a well of ancestral wisdom. "It has burned Silas. and now its heat has reached you. You can let it consume you, or you can use its light to find a new path. Her own story came out then, not in a rush, but in quiet, measured sentences. She told him of her own family, of her village destroyed not by soldiers or outlaws, but by prospectors who saw the glint of gold in their sacred river, and saw the people living there as nothing more than obstacles. She had been captured by the survivors' men, not so different from the ones Silas now commanded, and had been held captive until Jack's chaotic intervention. Her loss was not a single sharp tragedy like Jack's, but the slow, grinding destruction of an entire way of life. "We have both lost our worlds," Jack called her. She said, her voice imbued with a profound sorrow. "But we are still here. The question is, what will we do with the days we have left?" Their shared trauma, their common status as ghosts in a land that had taken everything from them, forged a bond far stronger than their initial transactional alliance. He saw in her not a woman to be protected, but an equal, a fellow survivor, whose strength and resilience dwarfed his own self-pity. His goal, once so clear, shifted. Retrieving the locket was no longer the point. The locket was a part of the past, a past he now understood to be built on a terrible mistake. His new purpose was not to reclaim a memory, but to forge a new future. He had to stop Silas, not for revenge, not even for justice, but to prevent more senseless violence from poisoning the land. He had to break the cycle of vengeance that he himself had started 10 years ago. Perhaps in doing so, he could find some small measure of redemption. He had to stop being the man who took Daniel Kane's life and become the man who saved someone else's. The sky over Redemption Creek was the color of a fresh bruise choked with a roiling mass of sand and dust. A ferocious sandstorm had descended upon the plains, a physical manifestation of the chaos Silas Kane had brought back with him. Visibility was reduced to a few feet, the wind screaming like a banshee, whipping grit into every crevice and turning the familiar town into a hostile, alien landscape. They had found Silas's trail leading directly back to the town. He wasn't running. He was staging his final act. A boy, his face pale with terror, had stumbled out of the saloon, gasping that Silas and his men, including the teller Abernathy's cousin, had taken Sheriff Miller and Doc Evans hostage. They were going to execute them at midnight. The anniversary, the exact hour Daniel Kane had died. Jack looked at Alara, the swirling dust painting them both in shades of gray. "Stay here," he said. "This is my fight." "No," she replied, her voice firm, unwavering. "You started this fire, Jack, but we are both standing in its light. I will not leave you to face it alone." He saw the resolve in her eyes and knew arguing was useless. Their path had led them to the same place. The saloon was an island of dim, lantern-lit dread in the howling storm. The windows were opaque with dust and the air inside thick with the smell of stale whiskey and fear. A large grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its pendulum swinging in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, each tick a hammer blow, counting down the final minutes of the hostages' lives. Sheriff Miller and Doc Evans were tied to chairs in the center of the room. Silas stood before them, the stolen locket in one hand, his pistol in the other. The teller stood near the bar, his face a mask of nervous sweat, a shotgun cradled in his arms. Jack pushed through the swinging doors, Alara a step behind him. The room went silent, save for the ticking of the clock and the howl of the wind. Calder Silas greeted him with a theatrical bow. Right on time for the final curtain. "Let them go, Silas," Jack said, his voice calm. His hands held away from his gun. "This is between you and me. It always has been." "It is," Silas agreed. "And they are the price. A sheriff and a doctor. Respected men. Their deaths will be felt. Just as my brother's was." The clock began to chime the midnight hour. On the first chime, Silas raised his pistol to Miller's head. "No," Jack's voice cut through the tension. "You're right. Everything you said at the mission." It was true. The confession tore from him raw and agonizing. I was young. I was arrogant. I believed the lies I was told because it was easier than asking questions. I took your brother's life, and in doing so, I destroyed your family. I can't change that. All I can do is stand here now and tell you, I am sorry. The apology was not a tactic. It was a genuine act of atonement, the first step on his new path. For a fleeting moment, Silas's composure wavered. His pistol lowered an inch. A flicker of something other than hatred, perhaps confusion, perhaps a ghost of his former self, crossed his face. It was then that the teller made his move. Seeing his cousin's resolve falter, he panicked. "He's trying to trick you, Silas," he shrieked, swinging the shotgun around and leveling it directly at Alara. Time seemed to slow. Jack was faced with an impossible choice: save his old friends, the symbols of the community he'd abandoned, or save Alara, the woman who had become his reason to build a new life. He didn't choose, he reacted. He dove for Alara, shoving her to the ground, as the shotgun roared its blast, tearing a chunk out of the wall where she had been standing. In the same motion, Jack drew his revolver. The saloon erupted into a pandemonium of smoke, splintering wood, and gunfire. Silas, his moment of hesitation gone, fired at Jack. Doc Evans, with a surge of adrenaline, kicked his chair backward, toppling himself and Miller out of the line of fire. The air was a whirlwind of dust and chaos. Jack fired twice from the floor, his bullets finding the teller, who collapsed over the bar. He scrambled to his feet as Silas charged him, no longer a cool-headed avenger, but a man consumed by pure, blind rage. They crashed into a table, sending cards and glasses flying. The fight was brutal and desperate, a clash of fists and fury in the dim, swirling light. Jack was fighting not for vengeance, but for a future. Silas was fighting for a past that could never be reclaimed. It was a battle of wills, not just of bullets, in the heart of the storm. In the wreckage of the saloon, as the sandstorm outside began to lose its fury, a fragile quiet descended. The air thick with dust and the metallic tang of blood was slowly clearing. Jack stood over Silas Kane, his revolver steady in his hand, its muzzle aimed at the wounded man's chest. Silas lay on the floorboards, a dark stain spreading across his shirt from a non-fatal wound in his shoulder, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, shock, and defeated rage. Sheriff Miller and Doc Evans were freeing themselves from their ropes, their faces grim but unharmed. Alara rose from behind the overturned table, her expression a careful mask of relief and exhaustion. The teller lay motionless behind the bar. The grandfather clock, its face cracked by a stray bullet, had fallen silent. The cycle had been broken. Every instinct from Jack's past life screamed at him to finish it, to pull the trigger and put an end to the ghost that had haunted him for a decade. It would be justice. It would be closure. But he looked at Silas, no longer a monster of vengeance, but a broken man consumed by grief. And he saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own past self, a man driven by a conviction that had led only to more pain. He saw Daniel Kane's face, and he saw the faces of all the others whose lives had been forfeit to his youthful certainty. Slowly, deliberately, Jack lowered his gun. He holstered it. "Doc," he said, his voice raspy, "see to him." Silas stared up at him, his expression one of disbelief. Mercy was the one thing he had not anticipated. It was a language he no longer understood. Doc Evans, after checking on a shaken but resolute Sheriff Miller, knelt beside Silas and began to tend to his wound, his movements professional and devoid of judgment. As the first light of dawn filtered through the dust-streaked windows, painting the ruined saloon in pale, hopeful colors, Jack walked over to where Alara stood. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He saw in her eyes an understanding that ran deeper than words. She had witnessed his final test, his ultimate act of redemption. Sheriff Miller clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You did the right thing, son." Jack found the locket on the floor near the altar-like grandfather clock. He picked it up. The silver was cool in his palm. He clicked it open and looked at Sarah's smiling face. The image no longer brought a sharp stab of pain, but a gentle, melancholic warmth. It was a memory, a part of the man he had been, but it no longer held the power to define the man he was becoming. He had found something new to live for, someone new to build a life with. He closed the locket and slipped it into his pocket. The storm was over, both outside and within. Weeks later, the scars on Redemption Creek began to heal. The saloon was rebuilt, its bullet holes patched, and its ghosts exorcised by the clamor of renewed life. Silas Kane was in a federal prison in Laramie, awaiting trial. His crusade of vengeance broken not by a bullet, but by an act of mercy he could never have conceived. His silence in the face of his captors was absolute. The cycle of violence had ended with him. On Jack's ranch, the world was greening with the promise of spring. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with a shared, quiet purpose. He and Alara had built a life together, their days measured by the rhythms of the land, mending fences, planting a garden, tending to the horses. Their unspoken pasts were the foundation upon which they carefully, deliberately constructed a future. One clear, cool morning, Jack rode Ghost out to the lone cottonwood tree on the ridge, where a simple wooden cross marked Sarah's grave. The wind whispered through the new leaves, a gentle sigh, rather than a sorrowful moan. He dismounted and stood before the grave for a long time, the silver locket resting in his palm. He opened it one last time, his thumb gently tracing the outline of Sarah's face. He was not abandoning her memory, but freeing himself from the guilt and grief that had chained him to it for so long. He was letting her rest, and in doing so, letting himself live. With a quiet reverence, he placed the locket on the earth, at the base of the cross, the silver catching the morning sun. He turned to leave a weight lifted from his soul that he hadn't realized he was still carrying. As he did, a final surprise awaited him. Alara was standing a short distance away, holding the reins of her gray and of Ghost. She hadn't followed him out of suspicion or worry, but out of companionship. She offered no words, no questions. Her presence was enough. It was a silent promise, an affirmation of their shared path forward. She passed him Ghost's reins, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. Together, they mounted their horses. They rode off, not into a cliché sunset, but into the vast, open plains of a new beginning, leaving the ghosts of vengeance buried under the cottonwood tree. The land, once a symbol of his hardship and isolation, now stretched before them as a canvas of resilience and boundless hope.